Welcome. Appreciate your patience as we're getting these technical difficulties not worked out, but work around. So I will be projecting our voices, and some of you have had me in class, so you know I want to pace, but I'm going to try to make myself as still as possible right here. Well, thank you for coming. This is another in our UTC election preparation series, co-sponsored by the Provost Office and Mocs Go Vote, which is a collaboration of faculty, staff, and students on campus who are just trying to encourage civic engagement and civil dialogue. There's another event next Wednesday, downstairs 101 at 12, that includes a panel of three faculty from the Philosophy and Religion Department. And so we encourage you to attend that as well, and I'll send out an announcement about that. As I've noted, there is pizza that's on its way, so please get up. I'm sure we might get like a thumbs up coming in here, but please get up, maybe not all en masse, but go and get a slice of pizza. Maybe grab one for your seatmate, but please feel free to get up while you're listening to this talk. So we're going to be talking about the state of the race now less than 2 weeks out. And so I'm Professor Jeremy Strickler. This is my colleague, Dr. Sarah Heiss. She's going to talk about polling, and I'm going to talk about different electoral college pathways and sort of give my sense of how we should understand what an electoral victory would mean for either candidate and what that means going forward for our country. And we'll have Q&A afterwards, so please feel free to write down some questions or just kind of take a note of what you might want to ask. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So Dr. Heiss.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to talk to you about what we should know about polling and how we can use polling and how we shouldn't. More importantly, how we should not use polling. So first, let's talk about what exactly can polls tell us. These are not inherently predictive. They are not often used for forecasting. It is the case that as we get closer and closer to the election, the polls will kind of converge on what actually will happen on election day. But the further out we are, these are really more just snapshots of what people are telling the pollsters at this time. These are just attitudes and intended voting behavior, which is very different than actual voting behavior. And so just proceed with caution if you're going to use polls to predict the outcome of the race, even 2 weeks out. The closer we get to the race, the more predictive they will probably be, but just that is not like their actual purpose or what they're actually telling us here. So let's frame this a little bit with like what people were saying about the polls in 2016, because a lot of folks were saying that the polls got the election wrong. And so these are kind of the three things that people will talk about when we talk about what happened in the polls in 2016. So the first thing is a non-response error. What this means is that the folks who don't take the polls are systematically different than the folks who do take the polls. The people who don't take the polls and do take the polls are different. If they were random, it would not be a big deal. But because the folks who are likely to vote for Trump were less likely to take polls to begin with, then it's harder to capture them in the polls. And that's where this non-response error comes from. It's missing those folks who are just less likely to take polls. And this is a related concept to these drop-off respondents. These are folks who start to take the poll, start to take the survey, but then after the first question or two, they'll say, actually, I'm done with this, and then they'll hang up the phone or stop taking the survey. And it used to be, in 2016, they did not count these folks. So if they started taking the poll, and they said they were going to vote for someone, and then they stopped taking the poll, they were not included in the poll. And again, it would not be a problem if these folks were random, but they're not random. Folks who tend to want to vote for Donald Trump tend to be those who drop off the polls. So people have stopped doing that, and they now include these folks who drop off to try to capture those hard-to-reach groups. The other thing that we're doing post-2016 is what we call waiting for education. It used to be the case that folks of different education levels didn't have that different of preferences or vote choice. And so if you got a bunch of college-educated folks in your sample, it really wasn't a concern because education didn't matter that much. And then in 2016, it absolutely mattered, and no one waited for or accounted for the fact that we had a lot of college-educated folks in those samples, and the folks who had less education were more likely to vote for Trump. So in each of these cases, you can see that we are under capturing votes for Trump in every single case. Now, pollsters know this and they do their best to try to make up for these kinds of errors, but there's going to be error all over the place, and it's just what you can do to kind of stop it, you know? So let's talk about what we should do if we're going to try to critically examine a poll. Not all polls are created equal. And so what should we do if we're looking at a poll? We're trying to decide, okay, you know, was this poll useful? Is it not useful? Who's in the sample? So the first thing you can do to critically examine polls is just to look at a poll aggregator. So there are sites that will actually average a bunch of polls, and on average, the average tends to be better than any individual poll. So sites like Real Clear Politics and the 538 website will do this, where you can see we've got a bunch of different polls here from different folks, different dates, and then all the results, and then they've got their average here at the top. So this, you can see, it can account for like outliers, and just averaging the polls tends to be more accurate than any poll individually. The other thing that you can do when you look at a poll is look at the source of the poll. So you notice in each of these cases, we've got a different pollster who is actually conducting the poll. So you could get really in the weeds and you could like look at the methodology of the folks who are conducting the poll, but the average person is probably not going to do that. So just to know that some pollsters will have certain agendas and some pollsters will have less of an agenda, and just knowing that going forward, like looking at the pollster, is a useful piece of information. Another thing you should look at is the number in the sample. So you can see here in every case, we have how many folks are in the sample. Now, this is closely connected to the margin of error that is associated with each poll. So the margin of error, this MOE here, is how off in either direction we can be 95% sure that the real value falls within. So for this one here, this margin of error of 3 points, we're saying that the true value, we can be 95% sure that Harris's real number is between 47 and 53. And that Trump's real number is between plus or minus 3, so 52 and 40, I'm bad at doing math on the spot, 6. Is that right? Close enough. You see what I mean, right? We're doing plus or minus 3 on both sides, and we're saying we're 95% sure that the true value actually falls within that number. Another key part to notice here is we're saying 95% sure. So if we were to do the poll 100 times, 95 of the times we would get a number, right, in between that 6 points. But 1 in 20 times, or 5 out of 100 times, we should expect to get a number outside of that confidence interval. So outliers are like an expected and normal part of polling, just because we know that 1 in 20 polls are going to fall outside of that margin of error. So just to know that, like, if you see an outlier, doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad poll. It just means that this is part of how polling works. Another thing to look at is who is actually in the sample for the poll. So do you see these like little L, V, R, V after these numbers here? It stands for likely voter and registered voter. And sometimes you'll see polls and they just do US adults. So you're going to get vastly different results and more or less predictive results, whether you're looking at US adults, registered voters, likely voters. The pollsters try to create their likely voter model, and they try to predict who is actually going to turn out of the folks who are registered. And that is, in general, as long as you've done the model correctly, more predictive than just registered voters, right? Because you're trying to only get people who you think are going to turn out. So maybe place slightly more weight, right, on the likely voter samples rather than the registered voter samples, because they don't include a likely voter model. The last thing we're going to talk about when we talk about polls, and before we turn to Dr. Strickler, is the state polls versus the national polls in presidential elections. Notice here, this is a national poll. Trump versus Harris nationally. When we're thinking about the presidential election, that's not how we decide who's president. It's based on the Electoral College. So oftentimes what you're really interested in is state-level polls in like battleground states. So oftentimes poll aggregators will create maps like this for you. These are how likely each of the states are to go either Harris or Trump based on the polls, and then which states they anticipate will be these toss-up states based on the polls. So they're saying that essentially Harris and Trump are as good as tied in Nevada, Arizona, Minnesota, Wisconsin, so on and so forth. And really, it's more important to look at where these states go, right, than where they are nationally. Because who wins the popular vote or who is winning nationally, that's not how we pick who's president. It's going to be based on the Electoral College. You need 270 votes. And so it's really about who's going to win these battleground states, more so than like what we're looking at here, which is just national polls. So that's all I've got on polls. I'll take your questions after Dr. Strickler talks, but on to you. Okay, thanks.
And again, I'm hearing some rustling out there, so it might be pizza. I will not be offended. Go. Autumn will go check for us. She's going to give us a thumbs up. Is it there? I could take two 3-minute break. You want to eat with pizza? Yes, let's. Is that fine? Let's go ahead and grab a slice of pizza. I'm happy to indulge here. All right, well, thank you. I know there's still some people grabbing pizza, but I'm going to go ahead and start back up, and I can fly through this and definitely leave time for questions. I'm actually more interested in doing some Q&A. So a lot of what I'm about to say is, let's see, it's well understood. So I'm a scholar of the presidency, and I'm a scholar of American political development, which is a study of how our political system has changed over time. And one of the things that I'm interested through that is the process of democratization within the United States, how we have become more democratic over time, and unfortunately, the ways in which democratic erosion is happening in our current era, which means we are democratic backsliding, say the comparative scholars who look at other regimes and kind of compare the US to other democracies around the world. And so as a scholar of both of these, I often get asked, like, how unprecedented really is what we're observing right now. And a lot of what we have seen is not unprecedented, but there are certain things that at least have very few historical comparisons. So I just want to kind of refresh our memory from where we were just in the summer, right? Where we had the first and only Biden-Trump debate. And it seemed like at that point, everyone was talking about Biden's chances, or not his unlikelihood that he was going to win, because of concerns about his ability to do the job. And then very quickly, what seemed like Trump's inevitability because of the way the party coalesced around him, only 2 years removed from a midterm election that they did not do terribly well in. They thought they were going to have the red tsunami, I think was the language that they were using. But over time, Trump became the nominee and was kind of having his march towards victory. But then Biden pulled out of the race and did something that for a scholar of the presidency is quite remarkable. It's a sign of presidential restraint, to recognize that, kind of think about one's legacy and understanding that the public, or at least majority of Democrats, wanted him to step aside and to bring someone else in. And so I could say much more about that. But of course, in very quick order, Kamala Harris became the nominee. And we are here. What seemed like a joyful, exuberant summer for her campaign is now facing up against the nature of our politics, that we are deeply divided and our elections are closely contested. Happy to talk more about some of these charts in Q&A, but just wanted to show you how quickly Trump sort of solidified what was some uncertainty about his nomination. So what are ways in which this election could go? And so following up on what Dr. Heiss was saying regarding polling, we're looking at the battleground states. So New York Times just published this a couple days ago. It's a really neat interactive platform where it goes ahead and starts with the assumption that Harris will have 225 and Trump will have 219. And then you can choose the battleground states, including the battleground congressional district in Nebraska, which actually gives out its electoral votes proportionally, so there's one electoral vote there. And so what I did was I just looked at what would be some of the closest ways that this electoral college race could turn out. There are many others. The one that the Harris campaign is banking on the most is the top one, which is winning the blue, what they call the blue wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and that little tiny slice up there is the district in Nebraska, which is Omaha. So they need to win that congressional district as well as the blue wall. But there are other ways, as you see down here at the bottom. She could win, she could lose Pennsylvania, but somehow win North Carolina through, I could talk about what's happening in North Carolina later, but there is interesting signs about, given their governor's race, how well Democrats might be able to do there. But then Trump, of course, as we see in the middle, has lots of other paths, including winning Pennsylvania and that congressional district in Nebraska. So thinking about that district in Nebraska, it is possible, I don't think it will happen, it is possible that we would have a tie in the Electoral College, 269, 269. So Harris wins the blue wall, but does not win that district in Nebraska. That's what becomes key. And if Trump is able to pull Nevada away from the Democrats. So what this would mean is it would trigger a mechanism in the 12th Amendment that sends the tied presidential race to the House of Representatives. Now, this would be a vote held by each delegation. Each state just gets one vote. So the more people in your delegation, the more you have to try to figure out, like, how are we going to let our state, how is our state going to vote? Now, importantly, these will be new members of the House. So it will also depend on what happens in the House race during this 2024 election. But the advantage currently would be to the Republicans because they have more Republicans control their delegation, their state delegation than Democrats. And then the U.S. Senate would vote for the vice president. Let's hope it doesn't get to that, but it is possible that we would have some sort of electoral college path where we are then focusing on the House. I will say one other thing here, which is that all of this is also then dependent on what the House does in its own race for the Speaker of the House. Because we technically, and this is unproven because we haven't dealt with this, but there's an open question about whether or not we could even resolve this until the House has its Speaker of the House, which, if anyone was following what happened in 2023, the Republicans took several contested days to figure out who their Speaker of the House was going to be. And then from there, the Speaker of the House would oversee the tie-breaking vote in the House. So if there's multiple pathways and they're clearly focused on these battleground states, what is happening right now, what's been going on for the last couple of weeks, at least in a flurry, and what will be going on for the next 2 weeks, is mobilization and turnout in these battleground states. We are pretty much past the point where where either party is going to persuade someone through traditional mechanisms of talking about all these different issues. It's more about now getting voters to the polls. And what we are seeing is two wildly contrasting operations for how the two campaigns are trying to do that. So the Harris-Walz campaign is doing a traditional field operation. So their campaign organization, which has much more money than the Trump campaign, is paying their workers, their staff members, to get out the vote. So this is door knocking, this is doing meet and greets, any kind of neighborhood organizations trying to go to where the voters are, and just trying to mobilize those voters that they know will vote Democratic. So trying to get voters who are pretty reliably Democrat, but maybe don't often vote. So maybe they skipped in 2016, maybe they skipped in 2020. But of course, they're also trying to build out their coalition by approaching and mobilizing what we would refer to as never Trumpers or more moderate Republicans who support the efforts of what Liz Cheney is doing, maybe some of those Nikki Haley voters who supported her in the primary but couldn't find themselves to vote to vote for Trump. And so they're focusing then on the large metro areas in these battleground states, a lot of the areas where minority voters are, and the inner ring suburbs where college educated suburban white voters live primarily, and specifically targeting suburban women, particularly on the issue of abortion. The Trump-Vance campaign has a different strategy because the campaign itself does not have a lot of money. They are not relying on their own campaign workers to get out the vote. They are actually coordinating under new Federal Election Commission guidelines the ability to coordinate between a campaign and what we call third-party organizations. Two of those are important. One is Turning Point Action, which is a student-led movement, a conservative student-led movement, and America PAC, which is Elon Musk's newly created super PAC, which he has given $75 million to. And what they are doing essentially is hiring people. So Musk, and he's actually working with Turning Point Action now, is they're paying people who maybe aren't committed necessarily to the cause of the Trump campaign. They just want the money. And so they're paid workers that are out there door knocking, but they're trying to target not reliable, not historically reliable, but people who they think strongly support Trump and that they know if they can reach them in smaller conversations, can have a discussion about the issues that they care about and kind of build that passion that they have, that they saw in 2016, that they saw in 2020. These would be some of those voters or potential voters that are not being reached in polls, right? Really, like, they're trying to do more small scale, get together with people that you know are like-minded and convince them that they need to get out to vote for Trump. And so it's really running up the margins of white working class voters and also trying to cut into the gap that the Democrats often have with minority voters and particularly voters, male voters, especially Hispanic and African Americans. So what could this mean either way? I'm not going to, I won't prognosticate about who will win, but I will suggest how we could interpret victories either way. So it's very likely to be the closest election in American history. If we think about 2020, Georgia, it was 12,000 some votes. In 2016, it was some 30,000 votes in Wisconsin. So this is a matter of getting every person out on either side. I don't think it's going to be a blowout either way. It's going to be a very contested election. And this will only reflect and then also reinforce what political scientists call calcification, which is that we are so terribly polarized that our polarization has become calcified, which means it's rigid. Very little can happen to break polarization. Not crises, not COVID, not economic recessions, right? Not January 6th. We are locked and set in our ways. And I don't think one election is going to fix that. So we are going to be locked in this perpetual cycle of everyone just, because every election is so close, the parties just say, all we need then is the next election. And then we will have a clear majority. And so that's where I think that's where I think we're going. But on the off chance that there is some landslide victory, which would be understood as a popular vote win, so a majority of American voters support the candidate, and the Electoral College victory would potentially mean a mandate. And that's when a presidential candidate says, I ran on this issue, the people spoke overwhelmingly, and I'm now going to enact that vision, that program. What's more likely is a popular vote loss in some way and then an Electoral College win, which is how Trump won in 2016. And this, again, would just signal calcification, but it would, if it happened in this way with Trump, it would just sow much more frustration about the actual structure of the U.S. system, particularly the Electoral College. Regardless, we are in an era of gridlock and polarization that we should not expect to subside anytime soon. Whoever wins will be dealing with, more than likely, an opposite institution in Congress. Democrats are projected to win the House, so it'll be a reversal here, and Republicans are projected to win the Senate, so it would be a reversal. So it's unlikely that any candidate, minus this blowout, will have unified government, which means we are going to be in for potential government shutdowns, the budget showdowns that we've seen. All executive positions in the bureaucracy and the federal judiciary have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. If it's a Harris presidency and a Republican Senate, that's going to be an issue. If it's Trump and a Republican Senate, it's more likely that he'll be able to then get some of those confirmations through. But even when we saw his first term, some of the senators were not willing to support some of the nominations that he had put forward. And so what this then leads to is increased executive power, which as a scholar of the presidency is something that concerns me greatly about our country, is that we are increasingly turning away from legislative pathways and just relying on whoever our president is who supports our party to pass executive orders to use administrative unilateral action just to achieve their policy victories. So as a way of ending, I will just note that I'm happy to talk about ways in which we can repair American democracy. And some of my students in a class right now called Repair American Democracy are going to be working on that. But I didn't want to end on a terribly pessimistic note, other than to say is we have to depolarize. We have to work together. We have to find ways to move beyond every election feeling like it is a crisis event. So much inclined to talk about institutional reforms that we could work on. But for now, I will just say, happy to talk about the election and happy to talk about why it's important that all of you cast a vote. So thank you, and we are happy to take questions. And I'm gonna try to repeat your questions. Also, feel free to get up and get more pizza. I'm not sure how much is out there, but yeah.
So with that popular vote loss at Electoral College win, we talked about this some in our class, but what would that mean in the future for the Electoral College? Or within here?
So again, you're talking about someone losing the popular vote.
Trump winning it twice.
Okay, so sure. So let's say specifically if Trump wins the presidency again, but does not win the popular vote. Well, it doesn't do anything to the institution of the Electoral College other than further delegitimize it in the eyes of the American public. I'm not ready to say that it will be a breaking point, but I do think that more probably than ever in our history, you will see a sustained movement, or at least an emergent movement to try to amend the Constitution in that way, or to work on these interstate compacts that certain states have tried to work out, where they'll basically make commitments. It's hard to explain, but essentially there's ways in which certain states will work with each other to delegate their electors if all of them vote in a certain way. So there's different ways that you can move around the Electoral College, but not really anything sufficient without amending the Constitution. And as we've talked about in our class, it is a very, very difficult process. We have not amended the Constitution. We have not amended it for any major structural, small d, democratic reasons for over 100 years. Women's suffrage and direct election of U.S. senators. But I think broadly it'll just be more dysfunction and frustration among the common American about why is it that we don't have majority rule in this country. Mm-hmm. Yep. And I was gonna sit down, but then I realized that by the mic. So if we have to turn it over, I'll just go ahead.
So does that mean in Tennessee, if you vote for anything other than red, because it was showing, does that mean your vote really doesn't matter if you're voting, or for a president or peace? It really doesn't matter if you're voting anything other than peace.
So the question is, if you are a Democrat in a red state or a Republican in a blue state, does your vote matter? Your vote always matters. Right, I won't say that don't give up if you're a Democrat here or a Republican in California. But effectively, it's the battle, it's the states that are it's the electors in those states. And I wouldn't go as far as saying that you shouldn't vote. Of course not. You can be part of a larger movement either way. That's what this mobilization is. It's a contest about coalitions. And you're a part of that coalition, whether or not you right? If you're a Democrat in the state and Harris still wins, you are part of the national coalition that she supported. Just like if you're a Republican in California, Trump isn't going to win California, but if Trump wins the Electoral College, as a Republican, you will be part of that coalition that put him into power. So think about it in terms of nationally and what it means to work together as an electoral coalition.
Yeah, I was just curious about your thoughts on the legality of Elon Musk's $1 billion a day, or something like that. If you sign his petition to basically vote for Trump, like, is that even legal? So is federal?
So the question is, and some of you probably have heard about this, Elon Musk is pretty much camped out in Pennsylvania now and will be there through the election. His PAC, America PAC, has a petition which I understand. I think it's basically, do you support the First and Second Amendment? It's like a pretty basic, and he has this game. I don't really know what you call it. He has a system right now where if you sign this petition, you are automatically entered into a lottery to win $1 million, and every day they're gonna draw a winner for $1 million. I am not an election lawyer, so I'm not offering any kind of legal advice, but the election lawyers that I have seen talk about this say that this is possibly a violation of federal law, because we used to do this back in the heyday of American democracy in the mid-19th century. Parties used to have massive celebrations on election day, and one of the things they would do is ply voters with whiskey and gifts and things. And we banned that. And so all I will say is I know that there are election lawyers who are very much concerned that he's skirting up against legality there. Yep. Good question. I know there's more questions. Yeah.
Houston. So a lot of people are against the Electoral College, but what would the proponents of it and supporters argue in its purpose?
Spread the wealth here.
Okay. So if you were, okay, I'll repeat the question. The question was, there are criticisms of the Electoral College, but what would the proponents of the Electoral College, what would they say its purpose is, or what would they say it's good for? So, I mean, the Electoral College was put in place on purpose by the people who wrote the Constitution. They wanted it to be the case that the popular vote did not decide who was president. In their mind, they thought that the population was not well educated enough or sophisticated enough to pick the president, and really who should be picking the president is a kind of elected body of electors who then elect the president. So that's like why it exists now anyway, right? The founders put it in as basically, we don't trust the people to decide who the president is, and so we're going to choose this other manner. So, I mean, I guess the folks now who would be proponents of this would say, you know, the people, we don't trust the people to elect the president. Also, the Electoral College, not forever, but certainly recently has favored the Republican Party. So certainly Republicans would probably be more in favor of the Electoral College than Democrats. Again, it wasn't always the case that it would kind of go back and forth. And now it is kind of, at least the past, I want to say like 10, 20 years, something like that, that it favors the Republicans. So that might be another argument for the Electoral College as well. You want to add anything to that?
If Texas goes blue, then there will be questions about the Electoral.
Yeah, if Texas goes blue, then people will have concerns.
I'll say something.
Okay. Yeah. Feel free.
So, the institution of the presidency was designed as a small r Republican institution. And by that, I don't mean the party. I mean it's not supposed to be democratic. There's supposed to be buffers between the people and our leadership, because the founders were very concerned about a demagogue coming to power off the passions of the people, and basically like a mass movement of people bringing one person into power. And so we have the electors, who are supposed to be the most educated and the most civically aware among us, who will make these decisions. It doesn't happen that way anymore. Electors are now selected by their parties in the states. And so what has happened over time, though, is that the institution of the presidency has become a democratic institution, a small d. It now represents the will of the people. And so the president runs saying, I will support you if you elect me, but they don't actually have the will of the people if they lose the popular vote. So it's a legitimacy crisis for the presidency itself. And I think who's to blame? It's both presidents who argue that they can do a bunch of stuff that they actually can't, and we're to blame because more increasingly we have authoritarian behaviors and preferences where we want one person to rule us and not do the hard work of democracy, which is understanding how Congress works. Yep.
All right, I thought the Electoral College wasn't actually real people. I thought it was just based on the popular vote in the state.
It is. There's an actual meeting of the Electoral College, and these are so when you cast a ballot, you are actually not voting for Harris or Donald Trump. You are voting for the electors that are going to be sent to the Electoral College. Now, there is discussion about what we call faithless electors, which are people who decide to go against the will of the people, and when they're literally in the Electoral College meeting saying, my state voted for Trump, but no, I'm going to vote for Harris. That really can't happen. There are like really strict constraints now on not only what electors can do, but also who they are. These are usually people who are die-hard members of their party. And so they run to be an elector. So they're a Republican or they're a Democrat. And so they're very unlikely that they would change. But that there actually are, the Electoral College actually is a meeting of people.
What do you think it? Actually, that's not that. So I saw that Harris is going to Texas on Friday. Why do you think she's doing that instead of going to like about?
The question is, it's been reported. I mean, it's happening. It's not like a misinformation. Yeah, she's going to Texas to do a rally in support of abortion rights. And the question is, why spend a precious an hour or half a day there when you should be in a battleground state? I don't know. I think it might be that there's some indication in some polling that the Texas Senate race might be closer than we think. And so Colin Allred could, in theory, beat Ted Cruz. So it could be just a way to, if she's president, she's going to need the Senate. And so it could just be more down ballot races and also the off chance that maybe Texas will flip. But I don't think it's going to happen. But yeah, it's a good question, but I think it's more just being able to highlight the issue in a place where it might, I think we're supposed to be talking about it for this reason. Like, that's interesting that, does she think that she's going to have a big win or is it misguided? But I think it's probably because of the Senate race.
I was wondering if Dr. Heiss could talk about like how campaigns specifically use polls. Like, I know like how we interpret them is probably a lot different than how campaigns are trying to use them.
That's a good question. So the question was, how do campaigns use and interpret polls? So it is the case that campaigns will do polls on their own. A lot of this is to see where they are in the race, first of all. So are they the front runner? Are they behind the front runner? Another way campaigns use polls, though, is issue polls. So they'll ask about what are people's most important issues, what are people's stances on those issues, because they want to know basically how they can message to certain folks. They want, if your most important issue is immigration, then they want to make sure to talk to you about immigration. If your most important issue is the economy in Pennsylvania, for example, then they're going to want to talk about the economy in Pennsylvania. So not only can they use it as just like, okay, where are we? But they can also use it to inform their messaging, which is super important. But campaigns will often, their own polls will often put themselves higher on average than they actually are. So, you know, take those campaign polls with a grain of salt because they have an agenda. Another question.
I was just going to ask, going back to the question about whether or not we should vote and we need to vote and the weight and the value of that vote, how important are local elections then to the bigger picture?
So the question was, going back to whether or not we should vote, how important are local elections to the bigger picture? And I mean, I don't want to say that local elections are more important, but there are ways in which local elections are more important. oftentimes you are voting for folks who are going to have a more direct impact on things that actually affect your day-to-day life. Like, will this pothole be fixed? What are the taxes in my state? Like, a lot of this stuff is done at the state and the city level. So in a way, and plus, I mean, just mathematically, your vote is one of fewer rather than of more votes. So, I mean, mathematically, your vote matters more too. And fewer people turn out in those local elections. So there are definitely more incentives to vote. And I mean, ironically, people don't vote in local elections when their vote would actually matter more, quote unquote. You have something you want to add to that?
Yes, and thanks for that question. I didn't mean to pass over the fact that local elections are important. I would say, as I just focus on national elections, our colleague, Dr. Chris Acuff, who studies the local elections, would be up here hitting me and saying, hammer them on local elections. I would say it's important for, if I think about it nationally, because we're so polarized, one of the reasons we've become so polarized is because our politics have become what we call nationalized, where every single thing, you shouldn't be able to know what a Democrat stands for if wherever they are. Like, Mississippi Democrats used to stand for something different than Massachusetts Democrats. And one of the ways that we've become polarized, for instance, is through gerrymandering. And local elections, statewide race, or state legislative races are how you address gerrymandering, right? So there are ways in which what you do locally, not only focusing on, like, it's important that you fund your schools and infrastructure, but there actually are there are mechanisms that link it to national politics, particularly gerrymandering, particularly like certain voting rights, like whether or not you have voter ID or early registration, because states are the infrastructure of elections. And so it is important, particularly at the state level, to focus on what's happening in the legislature. Yeah. Yes. And I believe maybe we have time for one more. I think there's a class at 1. I know we can hang outside and talk briefly, but maybe if there's one more. If not, we can call it. Ethan.
Can I? Oh, yeah. So it seems like recent presidential elections are mostly decided by a very small number of voters in a small number of battleground states. And personally, that doesn't seem like, to me, a very good way to run a democracy. So can you say a little bit about, like, we already talked about how we got there, but what do we do about that? How would we actually change that, if either of you have comments on that?
There are so many. It's all interconnecting. I believe that we need institutional reform. I believe we have to combat gerrymandering. I believe we have to talk about politics in a way that, I mean, I'm a policy nerd. I teach courses on public policy. I would love to talk about housing policy and not whether or not, one of the things we talk about is, as a way to depolarize, is the need for what we call cross-cutting cleavages. So basically issues that are not necessarily easily mapped onto Republican or Democrat. And economic issues are there. I think we need to have not solely economic conversation, but there are so many issues that a vast majority of the public wants, but they're not getting. And they're not getting it for institutional reasons, for all the gridlock that we have. And instead of continually having the culture wars that are purposely meant to divide and drive wedges between the parties, what you want to try to do is disrupt the parties in certain ways by introducing issues that are going to cut across. And so I think if you can do that, that means you're able to talk about issues. That doesn't necessarily get one on guard, like, oh my God, like you're going to talk to me about some issue that I code as liberal or that you code as conservative, versus let's talk about the minimum wage, let's talk about industrial policy. So I think part of it is just being able to talk more about issues, but then we also have to do the work to rebuild some of the institutions and reform them that actually incentivize the wedge issues as winning campaign issues, and that also seem to make every election like an existential crisis. It should be not boring, but we should have policy discussions about where we're headed, not whether or not like the end of our country is nigh because one way or the other. All right, well, I want to thank you all. We want to thank you all. Please grab a t-shirt, grab more pizza, and be on the lookout for an announcement for next week's event. And then we will also be holding a post-election roundup the day after the election. I'm not sure what we'll be able to say only the day after, but there will be more to come. So be on the lookout for that. So thank you.